Everything should be set
Okay.
up now, so give it a minute. Ask the audience, how is the sound? Question mark. How is the sound? And should be live. All right. I'll just check my channel really quick just to make sure. Yep, we are live. 12 watching. Check my channel really quick just to make sure. All right, sound is good. Jason, thanks for coming on. I really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Sure. Yeah. Hey, good to meet you virtually, Tom. Thanks for reaching out. My name is Jason Gallagher. I'm part of a ministry called apologetics.com. Ministry's been around since around 2000. Our founder, Harry Edwards, started it as kind of like a master's thesis project. And we've been basically on KKLA radio station in Los Angeles. I think it's the largest Christian radio station in the United States, just based on the number of listeners. And I joined up with their team a little bit in 2016, started doing some like guest appearances on on the show, and came in as a full-time host, one of the regular hosts. I think 2018, 2017, and so I rotate through there once a month. I'm on KKLA, and we just talk about apologetics, defending the Bible, giving reasons to believe. Our motto is challenging believers to think and thinkers to believe. So I'm a husband, married my high school sweetheart. I have three beautiful kids at home. I'm a deacon at our church and an engineer. I went to Stanford, got my master's there for engineering, and I just love to design stuff, figure out how things work, which kind of fits into this whole conversation stuff. I love talking about these things, understanding how reality works, how does a resurrection work? Like those were some of the questions I had when I was, when I first came to faith. How does all this work? Like, how does God save people? It's just naturally inquisitive. And I think engineers try to find the simplest answers, right, to problems, right? Um, so, anyways, that's a little bit about me. Thanks for reaching out to us and inviting us to this conversation.
Yeah, awesome. So I'm an atheist, by which I mean I believe that naturalism better explains all of the questions to the universe. Could you tell me some of the reasons that you believe in God or that you think indicate the existence of a God? Then I'd like to tell you my thoughts on those positions and hear your thoughts on my position.
Yeah, let's see. Got a couple notes here. Um, so I'll give you a bit of like a intro kind of starting point that I kind of had. I didn't know exactly your format. I don't know if there was like opening statements or what, but um, I'll just start going through some of this, and hopefully it won't be too lengthy of an intro. Um, but basically, I think it starts off with kind of my personal story, right? When I was 17, I wasn't raised in a Christian home per se. Um, Started dating my wife when I was 17, and basically her mom said I could date her like once a week, Saturday nights, and I could take her to youth group and go to church with her if I wanted to, right? And so it wasn't long after going to church with her that I basically realized that I wasn't in a right relationship with God, right? That I'd sinned against Him, the one who gave me life. I had basically committed, capital crimes against Him my entire life. He gave me life and breath, a world full of things to enjoy. And in short, I came to understand that I was a great sinner, but I also came to understand that He was a great Savior, right, through Christ. And that was it, right? I didn't need to be convinced of God's existence because I knew it to be true. It was intuitive, right? It was self evident. From a human perspective, it was that intuition, right? Knowing God exists, knowing my guilt, in my conscience, um, that I had kind of this existential and experiential reality that led me to repentance and faith, right? To receive Christ as my Savior. At that point, spiritually, I was reborn, right? I was given a new heart, a new mind. Began to understand more and more about God and His Word, but also about myself, about others, about the created world around me. And so since that time, I've been growing in my knowledge of God and seeking to share His truth with those around me. And you being one of them. I care about people in general. I want people to be, reconciled to their Creator. And so when you contacted us, and your question was specifically, give me some reasons to believe. And if you're familiar with Scripture, like First Peter says that you should always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that you have, right? So it was kind of hard for me to turn that down, right? It's like, well, God has called us to do this, and how could I not? And so reason number one, I would say, is that God is self-evident, right? That's the best reason. It's intuitive. Everybody knows it to be true. And I believe some of us have simply suppressed the truth, the self-evident truth of His existence, right? Romans 1, if you will allow me to read this passage, Romans 1, it kind of outlines, I think, my entire approach to apologetics and kind of these conversations. And it basically it says this, right? Romans 1, starting with verse 18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. For His invisible attributes, namely His eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made, so that they are without excuse. For although they knew God, right, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks to Him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. So I think the best reason is everybody knows God. They don't need any other reason outside of really being alive in God's world to know that God exists, right? And to know certain things about God, right? His attributes. And it also states that when you deny God, your thinking becomes futile, right? In other words, when you reject God and suppress the truth about Him, you can't make coherent sense of reality. So I think, reason number two, which is maybe like a 1A or 1B, is that when people suppress this truth, when they reject God, I think you see the evidence of that in their inability to make rational, coherent sense of the world around us, right? And, where the basic questions of life, right? How did we get here, right? Where did we come from? How did we become conscious, moral creatures? Can't be answered coherently. What is right and wrong? How should we live? How should we treat others?
Could you go through those one more time, the questions that can't be answered, but slower so I can type them out?
So sure. So, I mean, it's basically, where did we come from, right? How did we get here? How did we become conscious, moral, personal creatures? The question of right and wrong, ethics, morality, how should we treat people? They become somewhat meaningless or arbitrary if we're just, products of time and chance acting on matter. I think the entire endeavor of science, right? The principle of induction, the future being like the past. Those are all things that you can't really bank on or make sense of when you reject God and adopt some, other framework. Meaning, purpose. If this whole universe is just going to die this heat death, everything's just going to burn out, so to speak. Eventually, if that's the ultimate end, it's like, well, none of this actually means anything. Like, there's no real purpose. There's no sense of real ultimate justice. And so I think coupled together, when you reject God, you can't make sense of reality in a coherent manner. It'll always lead to some contradiction or maybe some absurdity. And so I think those are some of I think the main reasons. I think obviously people come to Christ because they know it's true, like it's intuitive, and I think you kind of understand that. And then other aspects is all of which I don't press necessarily just like philosophical arguments as hard as I used to. The cosmological argument, the moral argument, teleological arguments, transcendental arguments, so on and so forth. I think those are all good reasons, good evidence, good arguments that would give someone a reason to believe in God, and it'd be perfectly reasonable for them to do so. And then you have Scripture itself, right? It shows that it's transcendent through prophecy, foretelling the future, through scientific foreknowledge, through just the consistency of it being written over 1,500 years by 40 authors on 3 continents, speaking various languages. And then history, I think, shows the transformative power for good, for human flourishing, for liberty, for justice. So I think all of those are reasons.
Of Christianity, the transformative nature of Christianity?
Yeah, transformative nature, power for good, for human flourishing, for productivity, for flourishing in society and things like that.
Well, are you saying those are specific to Christianity or just in general?
I think specifically to Christianity, when you adopt a Christian belief, a Christian framework, it leads to human flourishing. And so those are a variety of reasons. I think there's a spectrum there, and some people come for any, and I think reasons in general, right? Like I think is somewhat subjective, right? You might have really good reasons to smoke cigarettes, where I might think that there's not very good reasons to smoke cigarettes. So whether or not someone accepts your reasons as good enough for them, I think gets to be somewhat subjective, right?
Sure, yeah, I would agree that whether a reason is good enough for a person is subjective, but whether it actually qualifies as evidence isn't subjective. That's subjective. Like you can test the validity of an argument. Does the conclusion follow from the premises? Is it cogent? Is it strong? Those things are objective, regardless of whether or not it's good enough for a person or not.
Right, but you could make a valid argument and it still might not be a good reason for someone, right? Like I could make a valid argument, say, for why people shouldn't smoke,
right, absolutely.
But that might not necessarily convince.
Right, people believe the world is flat even today, and there's tons and tons of great evidence the world is definitely not flat. So whether or not people are convinced by the evidence doesn't matter. The only question is it real objective evidence that people should be convinced by if they were rational? If someone was a rational person, should they be convinced by this? That's really the question that matters. And that's the question that I think is the answer is, well, no, I don't think that any of the things you presented would be convincing of a rational mind to believe in a God. So, for example, the self-evident intuition thing, it's clearly not self-evident to me. Like, I have absolutely no belief in a God, and I don't feel any intuition that there is a God. I feel quite oppositely the case, and so do the vast majority of scientists and philosophers who are mostly atheists. So I don't know what you mean when you say it's a self-evident truth. I mean, if it's knowledge, then it has to be a belief. We have to be able to believe it for something to be knowledge. Because if we don't believe it, it can't be knowledge, because knowledge is a justified true belief. So if we're suppressing the belief and we don't have the belief, then I don't know how it could be suppressed knowledge. I don't understand how I could have that self-evident truth if it's clearly not self-evident.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, when I say self-evident, I think I naturally tend to use design arguments, right? You've probably heard the very simple builder analogy, right?
Sure.
You look at a building, how do you know there was a builder, right? You don't see him, you don't smell him, you don't touch him, you don't taste him, you don't observe him in any way whatsoever. The builder could have died 50 years ago, but how do you know that building had a builder? Because buildings don't build themselves, right?
Yeah, we
How do
have
you know a
we have
painting had
induction. We have
the
lots of other
building?
examples of it, and so we can infer that all of these other things, we see a process by which it was made, and so we can infer that same process is how this building was made.
Exactly. Right. And I think the same is true for, creation, right? You see, if what's more complex, right? A building or, you know, a tree or a squirrel running up that tree, right? I think it's pretty clear that, you know, the greater complexity, if something as simple as a building requires a builder, then to look at something that's, can't say infinitely more complex, but vastly more complex, right? A functioning animal running around, having its own, ability to do all sorts of amazing tasks, right? To know that buildings can't build themselves, it seems to be, self-evident that something like a squirrel didn't just come about by chance, just like that building couldn't have just come about by chance,
Sure, but we see
or
lots of really, really complicated things in nature that weren't designed. We thought they looked kind of designed, then we realized, oh, there's a natural process there that we didn't know about that did it itself. So like there's these
right.
gigantic crystal caves that look like they were designed, but they're not. They're just natural processes, these things that are just hexagons everywhere, lots and lots of hexagons that clearly look like some kind of a mind went in there and had a hexagon builder. But no, it was just a natural process. So in order to conclude something was designed, you have to have an example of the same kind of a thing being designed in other instances. So you can say, oh, that's a watch. Yeah, we see lots of watches being made by watchmakers, so we can infer it's a watchmaker. But if you discovered something on the beach that's really complicated, but have no prior examples, it's designed like a tesseract. A tesseract is a four-dimensional object, four-dimensional square. You couldn't conclude that was designed just because it was complicated, because there are lots of complicated things that aren't designed, like the universe is extremely complicated, solar systems, storms, hurricanes, crystal structures, snowflakes are incredibly complicated. Just because it's
Mhm.
complicated, you couldn't infer design. So why would
Sure.
you compare the universe to a building? Because it's just a complicated things, and there's both complicated non-designed things and complicated design things. So just the fact that it's complicated doesn't seem to be enough to infer that the universe is designed.
Yeah, no, I don't. I honestly don't think complexity is necessarily a condition of design. Think of a. Do you know what a cairn is? CAIRN.
Like a
I believe
big
it's a place.
pot for fire.
No, no, no. It's basically just a pile of rocks that like indicates a trailhead. Something as simple as that. It's not very complex at all. But someone sees that, they're hiking, they know that that did not come about by chance. It's not complex at all, right? It's very simple. So yeah, no, complexity on its own is not indicative of design per se. But maybe you mentioned natural processes, right? You could say, well, we know natural processes that made these caves or whatever, these neat structures. Um, I mean, this gets into, I think, a cool point of discussion is those natural processes are being guided by something, right? Scientifically, there are laws that govern those processes, the way in which, your example was these cave structures. There are physical laws, physical principles, maybe chemical principles, chemistry, things like that, reactions going on, certain elements coming together. There's a chemical reaction. You could probably look at the periodic table of elements and look at, wow, this had this ions and these ions, and there was a reaction and it released some heat, or maybe it was a endothermic reaction, whatever it is. All of that is still being governed by a framework that exists in reality, right?
Sure, like the
And
laws
so
of nature.
the laws of nature, yeah, sure. Those laws, you know, actually have certain properties and certain attributes, right? Which if you look at them, would tell you about where they would tell you about at least how they could have been made or who made them, right?
I'm not sure I'm following there. So yeah, the laws of nature are describing properties of nature, like the law of gravity describes the property of curvatures of space-time and how mass interacts with those. But I'm not following how you can do what you just said of using those to infer how they were created or something.
Um, I forget which point you were objecting to.
Well,
But yeah, so
well, we started with
you have,
self-evident, but you said that we could use the laws of nature and we could look at them and
yeah,
infer that by looking at them something about how they were made or something like that.
yeah. So going back to Romans 1, right? God's invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood through the things that have been made, right? Um, what does science do? It seeks to understand those things that have been made. It seeks to understand everything we can about reality and physical and the created world, right?
Well, it
Um,
definitely seeks to understand reality, but what about the laws? Does
yeah,
what in the laws makes them seem designed to you?
yeah. So the laws have certain properties, right? Let's just say the law of gravity, so to speak. You mentioned the law of gravity. So first off, I think it's important to maybe clarify how something that's been made can actually tell you something about who made it, right? So if someone made you a nice meal for dinner, and it looks really nice, it's laid out on the plate beautifully, it's appealing to the eyes, you know, it smells great, you have a nice drink that's paired with it. It actually brings good nourishment to your body. The way that all the tastes blend together is, really appetizing, enjoyable. Um, you know, nice silverware, nice napkin, little candle. It's like someone made that for you. Say you never knew who it was, but you can learn things about that person simply by observing what they made for you, right? That person knows how to cook and they know how to put certain spices together. They know how to pair a drink. They know how to make things look nice. They have this uh, some artistic maybe eye they have. So you start to identify invisible attributes about the person who made the meal. You've never even met this person, right? And so the same is true when you look at these laws of nature, right? The law of gravity, for example, is it operates the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, right? Um,
How is
it's
that like a fork or a spoon or cooking? I don't follow. Like gravity doesn't actually operate the
okay.
same.
So
So
that law, there's an unchanging nature to that law, right?
well, no,
So
actually, that's not the case. Gravity was repulsive at the early universe, but I'm not like we can just grant for the sake of argument. Let's say it was always the same. How does the fact that it's always the same tell us anything about it being created? Like, for example, it could have just
right.
always been there. Could have always existed. It would always be the same. Why would its always sameness imply it was created and not just existing forever?
Why not existing forever? So
Well, specifically, like you asked, something that hasn't been changing, it's always been the same. Why would
right.
something always being the same indicate a creator rather than it just having always existed? Like, for example, I imagine you think God's properties have always been the same, but you wouldn't think God was created. You'd say God was eternal. So the fact that
So yeah,
something has always been the same doesn't mean it's designed. It's not evidence of design, right?
right. So let's look at more properties of it, right? So the law of gravity has a certain power to it, right? It has dominion, right? You can't escape its grasp, right? It kind of has it applies on planets, it applies on people, it applies, you can't escape its dominion, right? So there's this kind of omnipresence to it, right? There's this kind of unchanging nature to it, there's a rectitude to it, like a righteousness. There's a goodness to it, right? The law of gravity is not going to lie to you. It's not going to try to trick you. It's not going to try to deceive you. Um, those sorts of things point to the source of its creation, right? The cause of anything, right, is always outside itself, right? The iPhone could not have made the iPhone, right? The little battery inside the iPhone couldn't have made the iPhone. Like something outside of the iPhone couldn't have made the iPhone. Like, so no part of the universe can actually be responsible for making the universe, right? So no natural law could be responsible for creating all natural laws. So it points to something outside of natural law that actually has those properties, right? Because if it's unchanging, well, something unchanging had to be, responsible for it, right?
Right. So like we could say the same thing about God and say God obviously couldn't have created God. And so you'd say like, well, God wasn't created. He's just existed forever. And that's what most physicists say about the universe is that there wasn't natural laws didn't
Yeah.
create other natural laws or all natural laws. Have always been natural laws. They're eternal. So I'm not seeing I didn't
Have you?
understand the lying part at all. I don't know how like gravity's not trying to lie to you. I didn't really understand that at all. But the
There's
uni
just there's a rectitude, like there's a goodness to it, right? It's not going to try to deceive you. Like it's always the same. You could count on it to be the same. Um, Yesterday, today, tomorrow.
So are rocks good? Because the rock is always going to be a rock. Does that make it good? I don't.
So it's not a moral goodness, right? It's just it's not going to try to deceive you. It's just going to do what rocks do, right? It's
Right,
just
but
going to
but
keep.
not doing an immoral thing doesn't it just makes it amoral. So there's not a moral or good concept there. It's a goodness or a badness. It's just lacking any goodness or
Mhm.
lacking any badness. So saying something isn't going to do a bad thing just means it's lacking a badness, but that doesn't mean it's a goodness. To say it's good, you'd have to have some kind of additional property there. I don't understand why
Mhm.
gravity is good just because it's the same. I mean, it does change. So I mean, Guth's early universe inflation shows that gravity did actually was repulsive, and so if we based our belief that gravity was absolutely the same based off of today, well then gravity did deceive us. It does change. So I does that mean that it's bad because it did deceive us? I don't get it.
No, I don't. I don't. I would probably disagree with you on that.
On what?
Gravity deceiving us, right?
Well, yeah, I don't.
Lying to us.
I'm not quite understanding the way you're phrasing it. So it seems to me like what you're saying is that gravity is good because it never changes.
Right.
Therefore, because it never changes, we can use it to make beliefs about the
So
consistency of it or
yeah.
something. But that means that if it did change, then would that make gravity deceptive? Because I think that's what your definition seems to imply is that it's only good because it never changes. That's the goodness in it. And if it changed, well,
Right.
then it's not good.
Right. So Scripture tells us that God is upholding the universe by the word of His power, right? That He right now is holding all things together, right? By the power of His word, right? And so, because God is doing that, we could count on these things being consistent, which is the entire basis for doing science, right? If you're trying to argue that laws are really possibly going to change tomorrow or the next day, or then science would be impossible, right? Doing experiments today to make predictions about the future would be completely impossible if you thought that the law of gravity was going to change, you know, sometime down the road, or the laws of aerodynamics, right? Would you ever get in a plane if you honestly thought the laws of aerodynamics were going to change, right? No, you wouldn't. And so we don't live like that, right? And it gets back to kind of my point. It's like God can make sense of all of these things that we take for granted, right? That we assume and live by every day of our lives. But when you try to reject God and start to bring in these ideas like, well, the law of gravity could change and it could deceive us, well, those are like things that lead to absurd conclusions, like the fact that we we do all sorts of things every day trusting that the laws of physics aren't going to change. And I'm just saying,
I'm not sure
um,
I understand. So the laws of gravity
yeah,
did change. It hasn't always been the same. That's the consensus in physics. You can just Google Guth's early universe inflation
well,
model. That is the model in physics. So we do science every day knowing that it did change and that under certain circumstances it does change. So I'm not seeing an absurdity there. That's the consensus in science, and it's perfectly fine to say that laws of
so
nature
when is
can
it
change as long as they're
okay?
not.
When
Obviously, it would be impossible for us to do science if they were always changing at every point in time. But if they only change at
Yeah,
very specific locations or specific points, that we can still do science just fine. There's no contradiction
sure.
there.
So, I think we'd probably disagree maybe on some of these models, right, that you're referring to. They are just models, right? I don't think anyone was there to observe the law of gravity changing, right? It kind of steps outside of what we call operational science, and you're now getting into everything that we talked about the past. It's really getting into what we call forensic science, right, or historical science, where you're actually making assumptions about the past based on what you observe today, right? You're assuming certain things about the past, and so all of those models would bring in certain assumptions, starting points, right? And we may or may not agree on all of those starting points. We might agree on a lot of them. I'm not sure. We'd have to look more at that model specifically.
I'm not sure what you mean here. So, like, if I say um, Jack the Ripper killed somebody last week, and if we go back behind the shed, we'll find a body, and then we go and we find a body.
Yeah, yeah,
that's good evidence that Jack the Ripper killed somebody.
I
Because
agree.
so the same thing is with the expanding of gravity and how it was repulsive. It's the exact same thing. We say if gravity
Well,
was repulsive, we would expect to see this exact pattern in the CMB. We look and say, yep, we see this exact pattern in the CMB. There's our dead body, and there's only one model that explains this. It's this it expanded, and so that's really good evidence. There's no distinction between historical science, forensic science, and observational science. It's just called indirect observation. There's all the same science, but I'm still not sure how that relates to your point. So, uh, like, I don't understand how there's a difference between if gravity did change versus gravity's the same, why that would be evidence of
right.
or creator at all.
So I think what kind of got us on this tangent was the goodness, right, of laws in general, and we kind of started talking about gravity. But I think another way to think of it is something is good if it's functioning according to its created purpose, right? And that's what laws do. So any law that we have, it doesn't have to be gravity. It could be, I mean, think of just a mathematical equation, right? Um, I'm sure there's an equation that governs whatever model of gravity that they are using right now to look at the CMB, right?
Sure,
And
E equals mc squared.
great, I love it. Genesis 1:1, right there. Um,
What was not following that at all. I don't get it.
so Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? E equals mc squared. So what do you have there? In the beginning, you have time, right? God created. You have energy, power. The heavens is space. The earth is matter, right? So you have matter, energy, space, and time right there in Genesis 1:1. And what is E equals mc squared? Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. And what is the speed of light? It's just the distance over time, right? So you have those four things, matter, energy, space, and time, right there in that great equation, that beautiful equation.
Well, the equal sign means they're the same thing on both sides. So energy and mass are the same thing. Secondly, the first law of thermodynamics is energy cannot be created or destroyed. So
Right.
I'm not seeing how that would meld into the God created energy thing. It doesn't, seems like a very loose fit, but that's kind of off topic. I'm still trying to understand how gravity not
Yeah.
changing, or we can go with the mathematics. So a math law not changing is evidence of a God somehow. I'm not following.
It has a property of truth to it, right?
Sure.
It's truth, right? One
Sure.
plus one equals two, any mathematical equation. It's, when I was in college, I would bring a cheat sheet. They allowed us a cheat sheet. I wasn't cheating. And all I did was write as small as I could equations all over that piece of paper, right? And those equations, that's reality. That's like the physical reality. Like all of reality is governed, whether it's sound, whatever it is, right? Acoustic waves, they're all going according to these laws. Everything we're doing right now, our heart beating, our eyes working, optics, the laws, everything is governed by physical laws,
Sure.
which are not, they're the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow, right? They're not going to deceive us, right? They're not going to trick us, right?
Sure. Like
Things
one
like
plus
that.
one equals two is always going to be one plus one equals two.
Yeah, you could always count on that. It's
So
reliable,
how does that
right?
relate to a God?
So you could see, so these point to the source of their creation. They're unchanging, they're immaterial, right? They're powerful, they have dominion, right? They don't lie to us. They don't change. They're truthful, and they communicate, right? They're personal in the sense that they are communicating. Like a law is language-like, which language is a personal means of is communication, right? So all of these things, like that meal that someone made for you, you can start to look at it and say, well, I could learn these things about whoever made this meal. When we look at creation, we can learn a lot about the one who created it, right? When you look at a building, you could learn something about the builder, right?
So I
Look at
think
the aesthetic.
I am understanding your argument, but from the way I see it is that math and abstract objects don't exist. They're things that humans made up to describe reality. So I agree with you that math does tell us something about where it comes
Right.
from, and where it comes from is reality. Reality itself is described by a language. We can say there is reality. So English describes the reality. But obviously,
Mhm.
the English wasn't created before reality. We just made up the language after the fact. And math and logic work the same way. We made up the ideas of 1 + 1 = 2 to describe the actual existing objects that are over there in reality. So those laws aren't uh, evidence of a mind prior to the universe. Those are things, languages that we as minds made up to describe the universe. So they do tell us about the universe, the reality that caused these things to exist. But
Mhm.
it doesn't, I don't see how that would be evidence of a pre-existing mind, because they're evidence of human minds. They're languages that humans made up to describe reality itself. And obviously reality is never going to stop being reality. It's always going to describe reality accurately. But I don't see how those are evidence of a god. It's just a language we made up.
Well, English is one of many languages, right?
Sure.
Right. And but laws you said are descriptions of reality,
Yep.
right? And how do we come to find out what these descriptions are?
Uh, well, we just make them
Are they
up.
just arbitrary?
Yeah.
Is E = MC², just like someone thought of that and arbitrarily and it just happened
Well,
to
someone
work?
did think of it arbitrarily, and then we made testable predictions to confirm that it was the case. So there, all the laws people make up. People make up lots of silly laws. There's a list on Wikipedia of all of the incorrect laws that have been debunked in science. Laws
Mhm.
are things humans make up, and then we test them to confirm which ones actually correspond to reality, and that's how we know that they're true.
Right. But they don't just make them up like a lucky guess, right? They make them up with some educated rationality, right?
Well, both. There's lots of examples like Pauli literally just made up a few laws and they happen to be right. So, but yeah, I mean, most of them are made up by looking at past evidence, trying to find a pattern, and then inferring the pattern and
Mhm.
describing a principle that uh, predicts the pattern in the future, and then tries to
Mhm.
confirm the prediction.
Right. Yeah. So, they are descriptions of reality. I think that's totally fine. Um, but they point to the nature of reality, right?
Yes,
And then
absolutely.
right. And so the nature of reality is such that these things, these laws, um, apply everywhere. They have all these properties, right? And then just you got to move it back. Well, so what sort of being can be responsible for creating such an entity, right? Well, it itself has to have those properties itself and be even greater, right? Um,
I'm
and
not
so it points to
sure.
something,
I'm not sure I follow that. So, like for example,
right?
God is God. Like that's a law of identity. But I wouldn't say that the law of identity was somehow greater than God, or that God needs something to create the law of identity. I'd just say that that's a word, a terminology we made up to describe God. So it's not like our law of identity that we made up, Leibniz's law of identity specifically, is
Uh,
greater than God. It's just a language that he made up to describe God. The same thing applies to the universe. So 1 + 1 = 2 wasn't created by anything. It's just a language we made up to describe the universe. Now, obviously, it applies to everything in the universe and always will apply to everything in the universe because the universe is the universe. Like so obviously a
mhm.
language to describe it is going to apply to everything that is it, whatever you're describing. If I say there is a red ball, that applies to all red balls, not because the language of English was somehow predated all red balls, but because
Hmm.
the description itself applies to all things to whatever it's describing. Um, so I'm not, and there's lots of different languages of math too. There's base 10 math, there's taxi cab math, where there's you can get 1 + 1 = 4 in
For
taxi cab
sure.
math. So
Yeah.
I don't see how math is any different than English. English, you wouldn't say English is evidence of a god, right? Because English was made up by humans.
No,
So
but communication, the communication and language would point to uh, God,
how so? Because
right?
it seems to just point to evolution to me.
Well, I mean, communication is, a personal thing, right? And I think, you
Sure.
know, you'd have to, I think what you would get into here, communication is this distinction between the one and the many, right? And I think you run into some problems or difficulties there with trying to, reconcile universals with the particulars, right? I think that's been one of the struggles of philosophy for, thousands of years.
I'm not
Uh,
following how that has anything to do with communication, because the one and the many is a problem of ontology, whether or not there is one substance that permeates everything, or whether or not there are many necessary substances that interact together. Well, that has nothing to do with communication. Communication is epistemology. It's
or
purely,
language is communication, right?
yeah.
Right. And when you communicate, right? When I think of, you or whoever you're communicating with, right? You have to have this ability to differentiate between universals and particulars,
Oh, I
right?
don't fault. No, not really. Like language doesn't require
Um,
any universal instantiations at all. You can have languages that have no universals whatsoever. Uh, just generalities. So like babies don't understand universals. They can still speak and communicate.
right. But when they're communicating, like they look at their mom, right, or their dad, and they understand that that is their mom or their dad, right? Like they might not be, logically thinking through the philosophical side of things, obviously. Um, but I mean, this is kind of a tangent to where we're going. But
Well, yeah, I'm not. I wasn't following exactly how this was in line. That's why I'm asking. So if it's like I don't understand how the one and the many is works towards evidence of a god at all. I don't get it. Like even if we just
so
forget
I
the
would
language
argue,
thing, how does the one and the many thing have anything to do with a god?
well, I would argue that language itself is made possible, right, by the triunity of God, right? He is the context, right, within which personal communication is possible, right? Stars don't communicate with language, right? Bags of chemicals don't go around communicating with language. I think language it's a property of personal beings, um, you know, and I just don't you don't get there really from like a material naturalistic universe, right?
Well, I mean,
We're
there's
just
like
bags of chemicals, right? So if
there's
someone
computer languages, Visual Basic, Visual C++.
okay,
There's computers communicate with languages too, and animals, many animals have languages. I don't like clearly that seems like
communicate,
a product of evolution to me. I don't see how God even comes into the question. It just seems like
right?
language is a way for animals in the society to communicate with other animals in the society. I don't see any requirement for God there.
Sure. Like, okay, so if in a naturalistic framework, what are we, right? We're just chemical reactions going off in our brain right now, right?
Sure.
So, there's a great debate between Doug Wilson and Chris Hitchens where they're at Westminster, seminary. And if all we are is these fizzing, Coke cans, right? He says, can you imagine someone walking by a room where there's a Pepsi and a Mountain Dew? They've been popped open and they're sitting there fizzing. Could you imagine someone walking by that room and saying, hey, I wonder who's winning that debate? Right? It's a nonsensical question, right?
Well, not
There's
really. I
no
mean, because winning is a subjective metric. So it's like if we look at a bunch of chemicals bouncing a basketball and throwing it at a hoop and say, well, who's winning that basketball hoop game? It makes equally as little sense because it's like an arbitrary concept. Winning is an arbitrary concept we made up. So
Okay, well, forget winning. Say they just went by the room and two soda cans are fizzing. They're like, oh wow, what a great debate they're having. You know what I mean?
same
Like
thing. I don't see the difference.
But if we're just fizzing, if we're just bouncing around, like Dawkins says, right, just dancing to our DNA, we can't help it, right? Then there's no language, there's no communication, there's no bit, like stars aren't communicating, like stars aren't talking to other stars, like there's no language happening, there's no exchange of ideas happening.
I'm not quite
You're,
following. So like computers have languages. Computers are just also fizzing things, and they have
yeah, they were
certain
designed by humans, right? Computer
right, but
languages.
we don't need that part at all. We could
That's
say
how
that if computers just came about by evolution or whatever, they can still have
they did.
languages and transfer information just fine. Like there's no their origin doesn't make a difference. Languages
Right.
all need a transfer of information between the two systems. So even if we are just fizz stuff, I can still transfer a pattern of fizz in my brain fizz to your brain fizz. Like I can say, think of a pink elephant. Now, obviously, if materialism is true, that's
Right.
just a brain fizz in my head. But what I've done is that I've taken that brain fizz, converted it to a verbal language that transfers through sound into your brain fizz. And so I've mimicked the same brain fizz in my head into your head. So that's all language is. Like all of that just was
Yeah,
explained
all I'm
materially.
saying is like when two Coke cans are fizzing next to each other, they're not giving any they're not communicating. They're not giving pink unit saying, hey, think of a pink unit. They're not doing that. So I think you're kind of smuggling that in, right? You're
Oh,
saying
right, because humans are more than just
brain fizz
fizz.
can somehow, you know, say, hey, think of a pink, but yeah, I think
Right, because humans aren't
maybe you're
just
begging the question, maybe you're not, but
well, no, so because
um,
humans aren't just random fizz, they're patterned fizz. They have specific patterns that go on in the fizz that make them have motivations and desires and emotions and those kinds of things. And so the
okay,
communication is a combination of the fizz plus these desires, which are the patterns in the fizz. Now, obviously, a Coke
right.
bottle doesn't have any patterns, it's just random. So obviously, you're not going to see a random fizz communicate with another random fizz. You need a specific
So are
pattern.
Coke cans conscious?
What?
Are you saying those Coke cans and stuff, are they conscious, rational, moral, personal beings?
No, that's the pattern. So there would have to be a very specific pattern in the fizz to get those things.
Okay, so how are we different than a Coke can in your worldview?
Because we have a very specific pattern that gives us consciousness and morality and purpose and meaning and those kinds of things, which the Coke can doesn't have.
Okay, so you're just you're just making that claim, right? But you can't justify that, right? You're saying there's just some natural processes that we don't know how they work that give us consciousness, morality, the ability to communicate and reason and think and so on and so forth, right?
Well, no, we do mostly know how most of those things work. Like we can take parts of your
Yeah,
brain and stop you from having consciousness. We can deliberately manipulate your consciousness into having specific thoughts that we want you to have. We can read your brain and know what you're thinking
but
before you know what you're
how
thinking.
does consciousness arise from non-conscious matter?
That's an unsolved problem, but again, the best answer is naturally. Like God doesn't answer that question at all.
He does, right? If we're
Also,
made in his image, right? If he's a personal, rational being with a will, and he creates creatures in his image, then he gives them those properties,
okay, but
right?
how? Like, what is the process by which he imparts consciousness to a thing?
Okay, so we we could search that, but just because we can't explain how God did something, because we're not God, right? Doesn't defeat it at all,
Well,
right?
actually, that's kind of the point because that's exactly what you just asked me to do. So the same question is on both sides. Neither of us can answer
Yeah, but
the.
you're appealing to strict natural processes, strict things that don't go beyond the physical, right?
Sure.
So like I so
What
like
what
we
is? I don't.
like
I'm
I've
not
been trying to
following.
show, right? Like you the universe can't create itself, right? And those things in the universe can't create itself. An
Sure.
iPhone can't create itself. No part of an iPhone can be responsible for creating the iPhone,
Sure.
right? So the fact that we are these beings with consciousness, rationality, right? We have wills, all these things point to like they couldn't have just if they're just the result of natural processes, right? Natural processes can't themselves be responsible for more
So
other natural
so let
processes.
me
They
let me
can't
see. I
be
think
the
I think what you're saying is that
absolute force, right?
nowhere like before, if naturalism is true, there was no consciousness, morality, feelings, etc. before humans. Therefore, they couldn't have come about in a universe that didn't have those things prior to humans, something like that.
Say that again. Sorry.
So, like, before, if materialism is true, then there was no consciousness, morality, feelings before humans in the
Mhm.
universe. So it's impossible in that universe for those things to come about because they didn't exist before humans. Something like that. Is that kind of your argument?
No, I'm not sure I followed you on that.
Uh, like, so, because you said that in order for consciousness, like an iPhone parts can't create itself or whatever. So
Right.
we have consciousness, and consciousness didn't exist prior to humans in my worldview. Therefore, there's no random combination of things, of particles in the universe that could produce consciousness because it, like nothing in the universe, none of the parts could create the whole kind of a thing. Is that kind of your argument?
I think so. Yeah.
So I would
Yeah.
say the same thing about like
Well,
stars. Obviously,
mhm.
stars didn't always exist in the universe. They came about by combinations of hydrogen atoms that came together and were affected by a law. Same with
Mhm.
walls. Walls didn't exist prior to, or mountains didn't exist prior to them forming on planets. So there's lots of
Mhm.
examples of things in the world that weren't present at the origin of the universe. They're
Mhm.
called emergent phenomenon. This is called it's a
Yeah.
composition division fallacy. Obviously, if I said uh, it's impossible for any bricks to make a wall because it's impossible for a wall to be made of bricks because no brick has the property of wall. Therefore, no matter how many
Right.
bricks you add together, you'll never get a wall. Like obviously that's
Right.
wrong because walls are just a combination of more bricks. It's called an emergent property where you add in a bunch of things that don't have a certain property and that pattern can create a new property. So there's no
Mhm.
problem with saying that the universe came about and brains and consciousness are a result of a particular pattern in consciousness, just like there's no contradiction in saying that mountains or oceans or planets can come about by a certain pattern of things that didn't exist at the
Right.
early stages of the Big Bang. They're just emergent features. I'm not sure
Right.
why you think that's a good argument.
So, I mean, I think you have to look at, so there is a limit, right? There is a limit to what properties can emerge from natural things, right? That's what I would say,
I'd
right?
assume so, yeah.
Yeah, you know, and like we're talking about the Coke cans and stuff, I think it's everybody knows a Coke can, uh, a bag of chemicals isn't just going to one day, start thinking or, playing a violin, and doing those sorts of things, right? So I think what you are you're just basically stating uh, that it just happened, like somehow, right? And you're not even. I think these emergent properties, natural laws can't account themselves for how you can give, rise to immaterial, um, real things. I think that would be. I think another maybe place to go with our conversation is, um, this idea of knowledge, right? And you are making lots of claims about how things happened, right, or didn't happen.
Sure.
Um, and I think one of the shortcomings, I think, too, when you step outside of, when you God's framework, is that you become very limited in your ability to truly know um, what reality is, right? Like, for example, what out of all the philosophers that you um, trust or look to for your sources of information, or all the scientists, right? What percentage of all knowledge do you think they have collectively, or maybe
Just
you individually?
I would quote Thomas Edison, we only know a 99.999% of anything. Zero, like a
You
0.111, 0.00001% of anything, something like that.
so that's how much knowledge we have of
Sure.
reality,
Yep.
is a fraction of a percent,
Yep.
maybe. Okay. So could it be possible that, you know, something that you have yet to learn is going to completely contradict what you think you know today?
No.
Right? It's not possible.
Yeah, it's not possible for anything I could ever learn to refute the fact that I exist. Like, it's impossible for anything, any fact to stop me from existing or to stop me from currently existing at this present time. So I think, therefore, I am is an absolute certainty. There's nothing that could ever be learned to stop that from being true. And I can then say that there's some difference between my imagination and my experience. So, like, if I'm imagining a unicorn, I don't see a unicorn in front of me. No matter how many facts I learn, that's never going to be the false. It's always going to be true that there's some difference between those two things, my imagination and my experience. And each of the facts I know about reality are just describing like which ones are the imaginary things and which ones are the experiential things. And so again, because it's all based on my perception, none of those can be proven wrong. Like there's certain things that can be proven wrong. Like we could be in the Matrix and it's all a bunch of ones and zeros. And there's just the difference is there's these ones and zeros and those ones and zeros. But that's the difference is still there. And so since science is based on a methodology structured in existentialism, like, no, it's never going to be proven wrong. It's just going to be changing the things it describes. And that's it. Like, is it describing idealism or materialism or dualism? Like, doesn't make a difference. It's still going to be describing whatever reality is fundamentally. So not really. Like, there's definitely certain things that can be proven wrong, but most of it grounded in existentialism is not really.
Okay, I mean that's quite a claim to say that you have 0.00001% of all knowledge, all possible knowledge, and then to turn around and say that you know with certainty that you can't possibly be wrong.
Well, I mean, like how could I believe I exist and be wrong? Like, what possible discovery could ever make that happen?
How can you believe? So again, from a Christian perspective, right? If God has created you, right? Like, yes, we exist, right? But when you're trying to do that outside of that framework, it becomes nonsensical. Like, what I've been saying from the get-go, that you lead to these kind of absurd.
What could you explain? Like, what's nonsensical? Where's the absurdity? So in my worldview, there's no God, but I can still know I exist with absolute certainty, even though I only know 0.00001% of all knowledge. Nothing that could ever be learned could ever prove I don't exist. Because it's literally impossible for me to believe I exist and be wrong. What about that is nonsensical in a non-God worldview?
Well, you're just making an absolute knowledge claim, right?
Sure.
Without having the tiniest fraction of all available knowledge, right?
Sure, but I don't really need all knowledge. Like,
could you?
So, like,
I mean,
what could I possibly
do I
learn?
exist?
What?
You know you exist.
Yes.
Do you know that I exist?
Only with some percent certainty, not 100% certainty. I know I exist with 100% certainty, and nothing could ever prove I don't exist.
So that's be.
Go ahead.
Whatever they call it, like a brain in a vat type thing.
Well, if I'm a brain in a vat and I still have the belief I exist, then I exist. I'm just a brain in a vat. So what I exist as is different than the claim I exist. So when I say I exist, it just means my thought processes, my feelings, beliefs, whatever, that thoughts, whatever constitutes those, it exists and it can't not exist. And so how is that,
okay.
What about that is irrational in a non-God worldview? Where's the contradiction? I don't see it.
So did you think that thought that
Yes.
I exist?
Yes.
Okay. So what is thought in your worldview? Like,
well, I mean, I don't even have to answer that. Like, I can give you an explanation, but it doesn't make a difference to the question. Like, I could say, if thought is just brain fizz, that's fine. Or if thought is idealism and it's a soul thing, that's fine. Or if it's a combination, that's fine. Like, none of the different possibilities of what thought could be change anything about what I just said. My argument that I know I exist, or I believe I exist, and I can't ever be wrong about this. No matter what I'm made of, you could pick whatever you want to make me out of. I'm always going to be right about this. No matter what, if it's made out of like pink jello, if thought is just a bunch of pink jello flubbering in space or whatever, and I still have this belief, then I still must necessarily be correct. So, I mean,
does a fizzing, go back to the soda can, does a fizzing soda can exist in the same way that you exist? Does it know that it exists the same way you exist?
Well, I would
know that you.
Well, no, probably not. I don't think a soda has consciousness, but I don't see how that answers my question.
Well, it just gets back to this idea that I think you say you just assume these things that you can't really account for.
What?
right? Like
Well, I'm like, what am I assuming here?
I'm a thinking being, right?
Well, that's not an assumption.
But I'm really
I'm literally
you're a
thinking.
thinking, right? You
Yeah.
have these thoughts. Um, but yet you can't give an account for why what thoughts are, right? Other
Well,
than
I can, but
things,
I don't want to go
right?
down that route because it's irrelevant to my point. So even if I don't know anything about thinking or the universe, I can still say that I am thinking, therefore I exist. I don't need to know anything about thinking to say that because it doesn't matter what you change about thinking, it's still going to be
Well,
true.
the fact that you're thinking, the only reason you can think is because God has created you in such a way that you can think. Like you can't. So like Van Til says, like the 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 one who denies God and then argues against him is like the little girl climbing up onto her father's lap and sitting on his lap in order to smack him and slap him in the face, right?
Okay, but
The
could
fact
you
that
like
you
show that? Because I can claim that I don't believe in a God whatsoever, but I can know with certainty I exist without ever invoking a God at all. And you're saying that this non-God based
yeah,
worldview
yeah,
has a
yeah.
contradiction or something in it, but I'm not seeing the
The reason
contradiction.
you could do that, yeah, the reason you could do that is because you're, regardless of if you're affirming it or denying it, the truth is that you are made in God's image,
Well, that's begging the
right?
question, like you mentioned earlier. You can't start with your conclusion. So if you're
Oh,
saying
well,
that if
you
you're saying that
can,
the atheist worldview has a contradiction or leads to an absurdity,
you,
like if let's
yeah,
assume there's no God at all, where is the absurdity in me saying I know I exist? Where's the absurdity there? No God, I exist.
yeah,
How does that where in that worldview, the internal worldview of atheism, is that an
because
absurdity?
if there's no God, you are just you're no different than the soda can fizzing, right? Which you just said probably doesn't have consciousness, right? So somehow consciousness luckily got applied to you, from your worldview, and it didn't somehow apply to that Coke can, right?
Well, sure, because we're
And
different
so,
patterns. So, like, there's a pattern, there's a gazelle over there, and I'm not the same as the gazelle. There's a rock over there, I'm not the same as the rock. They're all just different patterns in the fizzing. But
right,
that's not an absurdity. There's no, like, where's the absurdity in thinking that
it is
I am a,
for non so for non-material things to arise from material things, or for conscious things to arise from non-conscious matter. Those are things that have never been observed empirically, scientifically. So you're stepping completely out of the realm of science and observational science, right? So you kind of have to deny what you use to make all sorts of truth claims as science, right? But you're going to these places where
wait,
you can't
I'm not following.
scientifically or
So
any of that.
I don't believe in consciousness is non-physical. I think it's purely a physical thing in the brain. So I'm not saying there's any non-physical anything. It's all physical. So
Right.
I
But
don't
you're just making that claim, right?
Well, that's just my belief. So your claim was
Where
that if there's no God in a atheistic worldview, it leads to a contradiction or a absurdity of some kind. So my
right.
worldview is there's no God, there's no soul. Consciousness is purely a product of material things. I have consciousness because I have that material combination, the pattern of material stuff that produces consciousness. The Coke bottle does not have that, so it's not
The
conscious.
pattern of material stuff that produces consciousness. I mean, you're just saying these things, right?
Well, your claim
You're
was
just
that there's an absurdity here. So that's not me not knowing isn't an absurdity. So how where is the
no, no,
absurdity
no.
in saying that I know I exist without a God? Like I don't follow.
The non So immaterial things arising strictly from some matter. That's the absurdity,
Well, right, but I don't think
right?
there is
How does
no immaterial
matter
things. There are no
how does
immaterial
matter
things in
give
my
rise
worldview.
to non-matter,
Well,
right? You
there's no immaterial things in my worldview. So that I mean, obviously, you're right. That would be an absurdity if I said there are immaterial things in my
How much
purely
does
material
consciousness
worldview.
weigh?
What?
How much does consciousness weigh?
It's the specific process in the brain going on, so it changes weight depending on the process. So it's like,
So there's a weight. So consciousness has a weight.
yeah, it's specifically the process of electrical signals in your brain.
Okay, so if it has a does it have a volume? So there's a volume and a density associated with consciousness.
Yeah, just like there's a volume and a density to the patterns in electricity in a computer. I mean,
I,
I can't give you the exact weight of the electricity going through my TV screen, but it has a
I
weight.
think, yeah, I think the absurdity is we've reached it. Like to say that consciousness has weight to it. My thoughts have weight to it. So if I think a lot and step on a scale, if I had a fine enough scale, I'm actually going to get heavier the more I think.
No, more of your neurons are going to be activated, so your thought is going to take up more of
How
your
much
brain.
heavier am I going to get?
No, you're not going to get heavier. You're going to use more of your brain. So the thought is going to be heavier because it's going to be using more parts of your brain. Like if you're asleep, obviously your thoughts are going to weigh less, but your body as a whole is still going to weigh the same. Like this shouldn't be.
But my body actually weighs less when I'm sleeping?
No. So your thoughts, those are just a specific process in the brain. Like your computer has a specific process of electricity when it's on. If you turn off the screen, the computer weighs the same, but the LED screens, they're still there. They're just off. So the screen, the image on the screen weighs less. The image on the screen weighs less because there's no image on the screen. So this should be really easy to understand. Like on a TV screen, there's an image. If you turn the TV screen off, the image weighs less because there's no electricity there. But the TV weighs the same. The TV is still the exact same number of pixels, but the image on the TV screen weighs less.
It doesn't have weight. It doesn't have mass. Like
electricity and electrons don't have mass?
It's immaterial. No, those things do, but what they produce, consciousness, thoughts, those things don't themselves have mass. So
well, that's just you begging the question again. So take my example of the TV. So that's just you begging the question. So take my example of the TV. In the TV example, if the TV is off, the TV weighs the same as if it's on. But the image on the TV weighs something different because the image takes up a certain number of pixels that are on. So if I have half the TV on, then the weight of the image is equal to weight of half of the pixels on the screen. If I have all of the pixels on, the weight of the image is equal to the weight of all of the pixels on the screen. So the weight of the image is a subset of the weight of the entire TV, and it can weigh something differently depending on how many pixels you have on and how many pixels you have off. So there's no contradiction in saying that consciousness, your thought process, which is the pattern in your brain, can weigh differently depending on the pattern without your body weighing differently. It's always the TV is always going to weigh the same no matter how the pattern changes, but the pattern can be different inside of the TV.
Yes, I totally agree with that. Okay. But you started by saying thoughts have weight.
Yeah, like the pattern on the TV. That's the same thing.
It's not weight. It's not mass. It's immaterial. Like how much does the communication weigh? The video I'm watching, like people watching YouTube right now, like images are coming to them, communication is happening, they're hearing. Like how much does that weigh?
The thoughts themselves.
All of whatever we've been talking since we started.
Thoughts how much themselves weight are the weight
lost from YouTube, and how much weight has been added to these people because these thoughts have come into their minds, and it's immaterial stuff. That's what I'm trying to point out. And I think the absurdity has been shown in this conversation.
I'm not sure what you're not following here. So no weight is added or lost ever. Weight is always the same. Energy is never lost or destroyed. It's only transferred. So the weight of the TV never changes. The weight is always the same. But the weight of the picture on the screen does change because some of the pixels are activated, so they're on the picture. Some of the pictures are not. So there's no weight is added.
To say that the weight, no weight is added, but then to say that the weight of the image changes. Those are contradictory statements. You're contradicting yourself. Like you've arrived at a contradiction, which is what I said happens when you reject God and try to rationalize basic principles of reality and existence apart from God as your starting point.
Okay, let me see if I can explain this. So the TV has a weight, but half the TV weighs less than the whole TV, correct?
Agreed.
Okay,
yes.
So if half the TV is on, the image weighs less than the whole TV, correct?
Half the TV's on?
Half the TV is on. So if the image is only on half, then the image weighs half of the TV.
Okay, no. Okay, we have a TV sitting on a scale.
Yep.
Okay. Now it's on.
Yep.
It's off. The weight never changed.
Correct.
Okay.
So if half the TV is on,
that contradicts what you told me. You said
no. There's no contradiction there.
Something immaterial.
There's no immaterial here. So again, wait. So half the TV is on. Half the TV is on. Half the TV is off. What does the image on the TV weigh? That's like the side with the pixels that are on. How much does that weigh? Well, it weighs half of the TV. Now, if I turn all of the TV on, what does the image weigh? The image is all of the on pixels. All of the on pixels then weighs
The image
these.
doesn't have weight.
By image, I just mean the pixels that are on. That's all I'm saying here. So the pixels that are on weigh a certain
Right.
thing, and the pixels that are off weigh a certain thing. The total is the whole weight of the TV. If half of the pixels are on, then the image, which are just the pixels that are on, have a weight. That weight is half of the TV.
The mechanical TV, the pixels, the little mechanical
Yes.
LCD screen,
Yes.
whatever, those have weight.
Correct.
Yes,
The
they are
image,
physical things,
the
right?
consciousness just means the ones that are on. It's still just those little things, those little physical things. The ones that are
So now,
on is the image. The image, consciousness, refers to the neurons that are on at one time. So yes, they
so
have a
the
weight.
TV. Are you saying a TV is conscious, or did you just use
That's
that as
an
kind of like
analogy.
an analogy? Okay.
Analogy.
Okay. So my thoughts, right? I'm communicating them to you. You're taking in my whatever I'm communicating to you, right?
Yep.
But you're not getting any heavier, right? They're immaterial.
Yes, just like if I copy a picture of a cat on a TV, the TV doesn't get any heavier. But the
So
picture,
immaterial things exist, right?
no.
Okay. Right. So my thoughts that are coming out of my mind and going to you, and you're intaking them and we're communicating about them. How much weight, how much matter has been added to you?
Again, there's no matter added. It's
Nothing.
just like
Right.
if one TV mirrors another TV, there's not any weight transferred between them.
Right. Because these things we're talking about are immaterial things.
No, they're material ideas represented by material shapes in the brain, which we've
Okay.
proven
Well,
scientifically.
matter has, physical properties associated with it, right? It has some sort of mass. So, I mean, the idea that we're saying, I mean, honestly, I think the absurdity is clear. Like,
Well, this isn't an absurdity. This has been
kind of
proven by science, like basic science. Like if I have two
the
TVs
science,
next to another and one has a camera and is looking at the other TV, and I have a picture of a cat on one of the TVs and the camera picks it up and then puts it on the TV of the other one, no weight
yeah,
has been added. That's all
I agree.
communication
I
is.
100% agree with you. That's the whole point, I
So
think.
there's no contradiction there. That's all materialism says. So that proves you wrong. There isn't a contradiction there. You've just admitted there isn't in the worldview of materialism. There's no contradiction.
No, you're something immaterial. Like I'm talking about immaterial things, right?
Well, again,
Like
that's not
you
in
said, you
the
said
atheist
thoughts have
worldview.
weight. You said consciousness has weight.
Yes, like the picture on the cat
Okay.
on the TV. That's all it is.
Okay, there's no physical mass. Does a snow screen communicate anything on a TV?
A what?
The snow screen, all
Like
the static.
the static? Only if you have a camera looking at it.
What does it communicate?
The photons, the shape. So
Is
again,
it communicating? Is it communicating any ideas?
if by idea we're talking about the shape, then yes, the shape. But I'm still not following how this has anything to do with my analogy. So you said there is a contradiction or an absurdity in the atheist worldview. In the atheist
Yes.
worldview, you are like a TV screen. Your ideas are the picture on the TV screen. The weight of the
Right.
picture on the TV screen is the electricity going through all the things. Now,
There's no weight, though. That's the thing,
in
Tom. A
electricity,
TV that's on and a TV that's off weighs the same.
does
And that
electricity
and that TV, that image that comes on the TV, is communicating something, right?
does electricity, like the speed of electrons going through a circuit, does that have a weight?
I don't think so.
The answer is yes. Yes, it does, because the electrons and the protons and the neutrons all have weight and mass. So yes,
The cables don't get heavier, right?
they actually do. When you send electricity through things, they do get heavier because you're transferring electrons. It does get heavier.
So how much do your thoughts weigh then?
The same as
When you're
the
thinking, how much
TV.
heavier do you get when your
The
thoughts weigh?
exact same. Your body is all a bunch of electrons. Some of them are on, some of them are off. If you
And my
turn them
weight never
on,
changes, right?
right,
Whether
again,
I'm thinking, whether I'm sleeping.
you're confusing the parts and the whole. Like this is just a simple basic philosophy text. Like if you have a TV with two pixels, one pixel is on, the on pixels weigh half of the TV. The off pixels weigh half of the TV. If both of them
I
are
think
on,
you're. I think you're either changing your definition of what something that has mass or something that weighs something is, right?
no. This is extremely simple. This is super, super simple. If you say,
No,
if the pixels on the TV, the on pixels, what do the on pixels weigh? The on
yeah.
pixels are half of the weight of the TV if half of the pixels are on. The weight of the TV doesn't change. It doesn't make a difference. It's irrelevant. So the weight of
Tom,
consciousness
I think
is
you're,
the on neurons. The neurons that
yeah.
are on is the
So,
weight of the thought.
okay. So I think you've basically, when you say that the weight of the TV doesn't change, you're proving the point,
No,
right?
no.
Thoughts, images that communicate things don't, they're immaterial. They don't
Oh
have
my
a
God.
mass associated.
Oh my God. So I don't know what about this you're not understanding. It's super simple. Like if you're
It is super
classifying
simple.
an idea, like the on pixels, just if you label on pixels, what do the on pixels weigh? Like all pixels weigh 1 pound, let's say. If 2 pixels are
Okay,
on,
forget the
then
TV. Forget the TV.
we have to
Okay.
because this is the part that
But
is
you're talking about
insanely
just,
simple.
you're talking about a physical
Yep,
object,
yep.
right? That has no consciousness,
LED equals
no,
neuron, exact same thing.
no
So
ability to
LED
reason.
equals
Like,
neuron, makes no difference. So the screen, if you're saying
okay,
how much
so
do the on
that,
pixels weigh?
that's an
Well,
assumption, right?
there's no assumption here. Like you said, there's a contradiction in the atheist worldview, which means I get to assume anything I want. You have to show a contradiction. You have to assume my worldview is true
Right.
and show there's a contradiction. So
And getting back to
the
where we were
assumptions
is
don't
that
make a difference here.
matter doesn't give rise to non-matter,
I never said it
right?
did. So that's not in my worldview. That doesn't work as an objection. So
But
again,
but you're assuming we're all matter. We're just matter in motion, but we have all of these immaterial
no,
things.
there's no
Thought,
immaterial. There's zero immaterial ever anywhere. They
thoughts
no
are
immaterials don't
immaterial.
exist.
Consciousness is immaterial. Reason is immaterial,
No.
right? Those things are all immaterial. If they're not immaterial, then
Oh my.
they will have mass associated with them, right? The more
Yes, like
thoughts I have,
Windows. Windows has a
the more
mass. It's a
the more
specific
thoughts I
process.
have, I know, but the more thoughts I have in my brain, the heavier I would be if thoughts were material things. If thoughts were
Does
immaterial,
does the more windows in a computer make the window does the computer heavier? Like if you install Windows, does your computer get heavier?
no.
That's the exact same thing I've been saying to you the entire time. Installing consciousness
Be-
doesn't make the Windows any heavier.
Because you're,
Windows weighs exactly
yeah,
what the CD
but
weighs. It's a pattern on the CD. The pattern doesn't add any weight.
one's,
It's just a different pattern.
yeah, because we're saying the same thing though. You're, so that is not, you're not you're not describing a strictly physical thing anymore,
So if I
right?
take a
Things that are
CD, if
immaterial
I take a CD,
don't have
Windows is installed
mass.
on the CD. So if I erase half the CD, the amount of CD that has Windows on it is half the CD. So Windows then weighs half of the CD. Does the CD's weight change? No, because what Windows
Yes,
weighs is this
because
particular pattern that
what
is the
you're, yeah,
Windows on the CD.
Tom, I think what you're exposing now is that information doesn't have weight, right? Information, you look at our genetic code, you're getting into all these things. Like, this is an immaterial thing. Software is just information. Information is immaterial, right?
Information
This
is
is,
a pattern. It's a pattern. The
you're going to go down
pattern.
another road that kind of shows that immaterial things exist,
Well, okay,
right?
so that doesn't help your position at all. You're just changing the topic. So the topic is that
I'm just
can you
showing
have
you on multiple fronts that there are immaterial things that exist that you can't give account for
well, I just
because
did give an account for it and you got debunked. So I'm still trying to figure out what about this you don't
so
understand.
information is immaterial. The
Different
information on
topic,
a
different
software
topic,
program
different topic.
is immaterial.
It's a
It's
different
not
topic.
physical matter,
Different topic.
right?
So again, consciousness is like the Windows on a CD. Like, yes, the part of the CD that has Windows on it can change weight, even though the whole CD stays the exact same weight. The part of your brain that has consciousness in it can change weight because it's more or less parts of your brain can be conscious at the same time, even though the whole brain is the same weight. This is super, super simple. Like, did
Okay.
that not
Well,
make sense? Is there a
it is
contradiction in
very,
that worldview?
I think it is very simple. Things that are made of matter have mass. Things that are not made of matter do not have mass. There are several things that exist and we use every day in our lives that don't have mass, right? That are immaterial entities, which basically in God's universe, it makes perfect sense to have those things. strict materialistic universe, you don't give rise to those things. You just assume them, right? But you can't, and this is the way things are, you just say, but you can't rationally give a coherent reason for why they are that way or where they came from, right?
That is, well, actually, we get a better explanation than a God in literally everything. That's why the vast majority of every
Who's
scientist
we?
the vast majority of every scientist in every consensus of every
Okay.
academic field says that God has nothing to do with
So,
any of these things. But that's
and how much do they know collectively
significantly more than
of
you
all
do,
the things in the universe?
more than every Christian that's ever lived.
Okay. That's just an ad hominem or, of sorts,
Well,
right?
it's,
But
it's
they know, you've
comparison.
already declared that all those scientists, all those philosophers know less than a fraction of a percent of all the available knowledge in the world,
Yeah,
right?
but I can still have certainty on things. So that the
And
amount of
so
you don't need certainty for knowledge. Like I
you
proved
can
that I can know I
one thing you
exist.
have certainty on. What else can you have certainty on?
There's a difference between my imagination and my experience. I'm currently imagining a unicorn. There's a difference between a unicorn and a camera. I could just infinitely many things you could pick.
And how about the origin of life?
No, we
Can you
don't
be
have
certain
certainty on
about
that.
any of that?
Neither do
Can you
you.
have any certainty on, you know, how, non-material things arise from material things?
No, and neither do you. So we have more certainty than you do.
No. Can you be certain that I don't have any certainty about that?
Yes, yes, I can.
You've just so you've just made all these statements that scientists have way more knowledge than any Christians.
Yep.
You just, explain to us how, images and, thoughts have weight. And now you're saying you get all this from people who don't know a fraction of all the available knowledge out there, right? And so here's the difference. Here's one of the key things, Tom, is we have a revelatory epistemology, right? From a God who knows all things, right? He doesn't have a pinhole view of reality, right? He doesn't have a 0.00001%, right? And so everything when scripture talks about, where we came from, how we should live, all of these things, it makes a coherent, rational, pragmatic, way in which we can live, right? And it makes sense of meaning. It makes sense of why, humans can have dignity and value and all these things.
Well, I don't
But
see how it makes sense. You just assert that your God has all knowledge. I can just assert that my dog has all knowledge, and I get this from my dog, and I have an equally qualified worldview. So how
no,
does
no,
asserting?
because
Go ahead.
no, because so you have to look at, scripture, right, to see that God has revealed himself in a way that is, meets our experience. It demonstrates his transcendence, right? That he is all knowing, that he's declared the end from the beginning, right? That he's declared things that we couldn't have known, like thousands of years before we discovered them, right? So your dog can't do that. You assert this God, and that's what people have done from day one. They built a golden calf when Moses went up the mountain. They want to worship something,
Well,
right?
actually, I would agree with you that
So,
if God made predictions thousands of years beforehand, yeah, that would be good evidence. Now, I've looked at all the prophecies and they all fail, which is why no one in history or science accepts them. But
yeah,
but
you
in
know,
general, it
they
just
fail.
what
You say they fail, right?
well, all of the experts in the field say they fail. All of the people who've researched this and know the
Well,
languages.
there's plenty, So now, I mean, that's what is that? That's the ad populist fallacy or something like
Populum,
that.
it'd be
Yeah,
more of
you're
an
just
argument for
appealing
authority, but
to
those neither of those.
some number of people as if they, So that's a fallacy, right?
No,
Uh,
Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy fallacies number 9 and number 10. It's the ad
you're
populum.
appealing,
So
yeah,
so
just appealing to quote unquote experts that you agree with doesn't prove anything to be
it's the
right.
consensus of experts in the field. So on
Right. And
the
how much of all knowledge do these experts have?
uh, again, same thing. I don't need all knowledge to know things with certainty. So uh,
Well, you
as
said you can
it's
know like a couple of
well, I
things with
just I
certainty.
just listed a whole bunch of things, but as it says, like on the reference I
Okay,
just
but
gave
these
you.
people who have almost
Wait, one second, one second, one second. So on the reference I just gave you, it lists the ad populum and argumentum ad authorium fallacies, which specifically say they're only fallacies if they're not actual authorities. So it's not an authority, it's not a fallacy to quote authorities of the consensus of experts in the field
right. So if
on a
someone gets a
topic.
PhD and they're an authority,
The consensus is the vast majority of experts who all have researched this and know more than anybody else.
And
It's
how
not. It's not.
often
It's not one. It's the consensus.
could the consensus be wrong?
Yes, and that doesn't
Okay.
mean they are though. So the
No, but
consensus
they
is more
still,
likely to be
they
right than anything
still,
you've presented.
right, but they have, so if they reject God as well, then they are looking through a pinhole view of reality, right? And you're appealing to them, you know, as they are your authorities, right? They are your black robe regimen, so to speak, right? And you appeal to them as your arbiters of truth, right? You appeal to them the way a Christian appeals to Scripture, right? To
Well, not exactly.
to
So I can.
a God who has shown Himself, right, in His Word, demonstrated His transcendence. He's also stepped into history, right? He came here 2,000 years ago, right? He stepped into history, the person of Christ, right? He lived, he died. It's a historical record. He rose from the dead, and historically verifiable, and you know, demonstrated that he is true, right? And the main thing, Tom, is like that God is the one who, while we were sinning against Him, like came into this world to love us, to forgive us, so that we can, have a view of reality that is not based on a 0.00001% of all available knowledge, but that He, the one who knows all things, can reveal truth to us, and that we can make sense of the world in which we live, right?
Well,
We didn't even
that's what I
get
don't
to a
think
lot
is
of
right. So I don't
uh,
follow because it seems like if you're just saying God has all knowledge and God tells me so, like that doesn't show you're not a brain in the vat. You're not just imagining it. That doesn't give you any more certainty. That gives you less certainty than science.
well, he's demonstrated it, right? It's not just God tells me so. He's actually demonstrated it, right?
What do you mean? Where
And
did he demonstrate it?
he's demonstrated it through His Word, through the transcendent nature of His Word, right?
I don't know
He's
what that means.
demonstrated it in history. So the transcendent nature of God's Word, right? Transcendent properties, right? Being able to tell the future from the past, right? To declare the future before it comes to pass, right?
Well,
To
yeah,
declare
I
things.
agree that declaring the future before it passes is great evidence. I just haven't seen that ever happen. And when we actually look at
Right.
the Greek and have the people who can read Greek, the experts, actually read it and say, "Oh, it doesn't actually predict anything," it seems like it doesn't make any predictions. So I don't, and that's not like
Well,
just the
we'd have to
authority.
do
Like
like
we,
we'd have to do a more in-depth study. But I'm just telling you, this whole topic was reasons to believe, right? And
right.
there are myriad of reasons to believe in God, to believe in the Christian God, the triune God of Scripture, um, and there's nothing invalid about them. There's nothing unreasonable about them. They're perfectly reasonable. They match with our experience, right? They match with um, you know the science, the ability to do science, the ability to trust that the future is going to be like the past, like that the laws aren't going to change, like going back to everything kind of where we started, right? We've shown, or at least discussed, maybe people will decide for themselves, um, what they find reasonable and what they don't, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But
But like we said in the beginning, there's a difference between what someone finds reasonable and is something objectively not reasonable. Like the first thing you said was a composition division fallacy. The second thing was confusing my description of not of assuming something with being a logical contradiction, which are two separate things. Like even if I assume all brains are consciousness, that's not a contradiction in my worldview. So that is an invalid argument that you presented, saying that there's a contradiction and I assume something. Invalid argument. So
and
it does seem like the arguments you presented are actually invalid. They're not. They're objectively not reasonable.
yeah, I don't think you haven't demonstrated that by any means, right?
Well, I mean, I think it did because your arguments were one minds can't come from non-minds, essentially, to paraphrase, which is
Minds can't come from
but
non-mind.
like humans have minds
We
and
talk about
consciousness.
matter and immaterial things arising from immaterial things arising from material things, um, which just doesn't make rational sense. It's not. coherent, right?
Yeah, but again, that's not how the argument.
We,
If you say there's a contradiction in my worldview, you can't then
yeah,
say here's a thing that's outside of your worldview that's a contradiction. Like that's it doesn't work. You have to show in my worldview where the contradiction is. So like if I said Jesus ate babies, therefore Jesus is evil, like you'd be like that. No, that's clearly not a contradiction in the Bible because it didn't happen in the Bible. Like so to say there's a contradiction in the Bible, you have to use only the things in the Bible, or else it's a straw man. So the same thing applies to my worldview. You can't say there's a contradiction in my worldview, but here's a thing that's not in your worldview. It doesn't work that way. So in my worldview, I said there are no non-material things, and so there aren't non-material things. Don't come from material things. It doesn't happen in my worldview. Thoughts are material, so that's not a contradiction. Um, so I kind of did show that was a
right.
fallacy.
But I'm just saying, yeah, that's your worldview, right? You believe that, but I don't think when you look into that, when you press it, it doesn't. It falls apart, right? It leads to absurd things, like you said, like you weigh more when you're sleeping versus when you're not sleeping.
I
Like,
did not say that. I said you don't. Your thoughts weigh more, not you. Your body weighs the same. Just like a computer with half of Windows weighs half as much.
where are those thoughts? Like,
What? They're literally in your
where are
brain.
those thoughts in your brain with neurons, right?
Yep.
So your thoughts weigh more, but you don't weigh more. So you're saying something absurd, right? Which is kind of the point. That was the outset, right? When you reject God, you're left with either something contradictory or absurd. I would
Uh,
argue, Tom, I think you would agree that if we're found to have a worldview that leads to something contradictory or absurd, that we should abandon that worldview.
sure.
Okay. So if you have things that lead to contradictions or absurdity, I would say you should abandon that worldview, right? And adopt one that doesn't lead to those things. And my heart for you, you are not an enemy in any means towards Christianity, towards myself. You have different opinions, different perspectives. But if anything, this dialogue I think is very healthy, very beneficial because it helps refine things that I believe. And my ultimate goal is for you to be blessed, right? And in Psalm 1 it talks about the man who is blessed, everything he does prospers, right? And the one who is blessed is the one who is in a right relationship with God, right? And that's my desire for you, that you would be in a right relationship with God, that you would know the one who created you, who gave you life and breath and the ability to reason and think and do all these great things. Um, but just like physical laws have consequences, right? Gravity, if you jump out of a plane without a parachute, there's consequences to that, right? Moral laws have consequences as well, right? If we sin against God, the creator, there are consequences. And that's what my true desire is for you to be in a right relationship where, you're reconciled and to the one who created you, and I think that's what's at stake for all these people listening. Um, is, there's a real world out there that, God has created. And, I want people to know him so that they can have right thoughts about, all of these things and make sense of our lives and, the lives of people around us and love people, love God, love people. That's like the greatest commandment, right? Um, and that's my hope for you. And that's,
Yeah,
yeah,
thanks. I appreciate the sentiment, and I appreciate the conversation for sure. And I agree that our goal should be truth and pursuing knowledge. And I think that obviously, I think my worldview does that more accurately, and you think your worldview does that more accurately. And it's a fun conversation. So I appreciate you coming on. You said you had to go pretty soon.
so much more I wanted to chat with you about. I don't know
Do
if
you
you
have
want
more
to do
time
this.
or?
I got to run. I got to be somewhere at 3 o'clock.
Gotcha.
But I'd love to chat about, some of your views on ethics and morality and
Sure.
this whole idea of, involuntary imposition of people's wills and things like that. I think there's a lot of interesting things to talk about there, and
Sure. Definitely.
maybe we'll do that sometime.
Definitely. I'll send you an email later. Thanks again for coming on. I appreciate your time, and I'll let you go.
All right, dude. You take care, man.
Have a nice day. I wonder.